In the heart of a quiet suburban neighborhood, the morning hums with life. Lawns gleam with morning dew, and the streets echo with the occasional bark of a dog or laughter of children. Among the many houses lining this idyllic street stands the home of the Johnsons, a warm, lively household filled with laughter, hope, and the hustle of everyday life. Despite their joyful spirit, the Johnsons have faced challenges not unfamiliar to families who break societal norms by living in spaces where diversity is scarce. Conversations over fences and polite smiles often come tinged with subtle hesitation from a handful of neighbors unwilling to embrace change. But the Johnsons remain steadfast, determined to live fully without apology or fear. On this particular afternoon, the neighborhood appeared serene, but under the surface, tensions simmered. When little Jamal Johnson ran outside to retrieve his soccer ball, his joyful shouts seemed ordinary. But from across the street, a scowl formed on the face of Mrs. Whitaker, a long-time resident wary of what she perceived as disruption to her sense of order. Mrs. Whitaker had never fully warmed to the Johnsons. In her mind, their presence was an unwelcome shift from the familiar suburban image she clung to. While most neighbors adjusted and even grew fond of the Johnsons, Mrs. Whitaker remained entrenched in outdated prejudices. A seemingly mundane moment became the spark for what would soon escalate into a dramatic confrontation. Mrs. Whitaker's furrowed brow deepened as she reached for her phone, convinced she was doing her duty to preserve the neighborhood's peace. With each ring to the police, a line was drawn in a battle neither side had anticipated. The Johnsons, unaware of the brewing storm, went about their day, Jamal still outside laughing and kicking his ball. The scene was as normal as any summer afternoon, yet it held the makings of an incident that would change the neighborhood forever. As the sirens wailed in the distance, drawing ever closer, Mrs. Whitaker folded her arms, satisfaction flickering in her eyes. The Johnsons turned their heads, puzzled, and for the first time, worry crept into their hearts. They had always known that their presence here was scrutinized by some, but this, the arrival of the police at their doorstep, was something they hadn't expected. The flashing blue and red lights reflected off the Johnsons' windows, casting eerie shadows across their living room walls. Anxiety tightened in Mr. Johnson's chest as he exchanged a glance with his wife, Tanya. Their son Jamal stood frozen by the door, his wide eyes filled with confusion. "What's going on, Daddy?" Jamal's innocent question hung heavy in the air. "I'm not sure, buddy," Mr. Johnson said gently, trying to keep his voice calm despite the fear gnawing at his resolve. Outside, two officers stepped out of their cruiser, their boots crunching against the gravel driveway. Mrs. Whitaker watched from her porch, her arms crossed smugly as if justice were being served. "We have a call about a disturbance," one of the officers announced as he approached the Johnsons' front yard. His tone was measured but authoritative. "A disturbance?" Mr. Johnson asked, stepping forward cautiously. "We've been inside all afternoon. My son was just playing in the yard." The officer glanced at Jamal, then toward Mrs. Whitaker, who wasted no time offering her version of the situation. "They're always making noise," she said loudly. "That boy is out here unsupervised, running wild. It's a safety issue for the neighborhood." Tanya, standing protectively behind her husband, clenched her fists. "Unsupervised? We've been home the entire time." The officer took notes, his face neutral. But beneath the surface, something began to shift, subtle signs that this call wasn't sitting well with him. The scene before him didn't align with the urgency of the complaint. He scanned the yard. No signs of chaos, no unruly behavior, just a family being unfairly scrutinized. Meanwhile, neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispering among themselves. Some frowned at Mrs. Whitaker's behavior, silently disapproving of her actions but hesitant to intervene. Others simply watched with curiosity, oblivious to the deeper issue at play. Mr. Johnson took a steadying breath. "We've lived here for years. We're good neighbors, respectful ones. My son was just being a kid, not causing any harm." The officer nodded, but remained professional. "Let's talk inside," he offered. The second officer stayed back, speaking with Mrs. Whitaker as her complaints grew increasingly irrational. Inside the Johnson home, the atmosphere was tense but composed. Tanya poured water for the officer, who politely declined. "I'm Officer Daniels," he introduced himself. "I want to get to the bottom of this fairly." The Johnsons appreciated his respectful tone, but knew too well that appearances often masked underlying bias. "We've had issues with that neighbor before," Tanya explained. "She's called the HOA about us for the most trivial things. Our lawn, our guests, even the volume of our conversations on the porch. But this? Calling the police over my son playing soccer?" Her voice trembled with frustration. Daniels listened intently. "I'm sorry you're dealing with this. I'll be honest, not every call we respond to is justified. Unfortunately, some people weaponize law enforcement when it's unnecessary." His acknowledgement surprised the Johnsons. They had expected defensiveness or indifference, but this officer appeared to be listening and understanding. Outside, the confrontation continued as Mrs. Whitaker grew flustered under questioning. "I'm just saying they don't fit here," she blurted, betraying the prejudice that had fueled her actions. The second officer's raised brow signaled disapproval, his stance shifting from neutral observer to quiet ally of the truth. Back inside, Officer Daniels spoke softly. "I'm going to file a report indicating there was no disturbance and that this was likely a misuse of emergency services." His candidness gave the Johnsons a glimmer of relief. "What about Mrs. Whitaker?" Tanya asked cautiously. "There are consequences for false reports," Daniels assured them. "But more importantly, your family deserves to feel safe and respected here." The Johnsons nodded, their gratitude tempered by the emotional weight of the encounter. For too long, they had endured microaggressions without recourse. Perhaps this time would be different. Daniels stood to leave but paused. "If you ever need anything or face anything like this again, don't hesitate to reach out. We're here to serve and protect, not intimidate." Outside, Mrs. Whitaker's self-righteous demeanor had crumbled under questioning. Her words faltered as neighbors began stepping onto their porches, silently bearing witness to the unfolding scene. One neighbor, a middle-aged man named Carl, finally spoke up. "This isn't right, and we all know it. The Johnsons are good people." His voice carried across the street, cutting through the tension. Mrs. Whitaker glared but said nothing. The tide was turning. As the weight of Carl's words settled over the street, murmurs rippled through the gathering crowd. More neighbors began to step forward, emboldened by his stand against Mrs. Whitaker's actions. "I've never had a problem with the Johnsons," another neighbor added. "They've always been respectful." Mrs. Whitaker's lips tightened. "You all don't see what I see. I'm just trying to keep the neighborhood safe." Officer Daniels, now joined by his partner, walked back toward the crowd. His voice was firm but measured. "There's no evidence of any wrongdoing by the Johnson family," he announced. "We're here to serve the community, not to enforce personal grievances." Mrs. Whitaker's face reddened. "You're taking their side? They're disturbing the peace, and you're ignoring it." Daniels's calm remained unshaken. "Ma'am, calling law enforcement over non-issues strains public resources. It also puts families like the Johnsons in unfair situations. This is not about keeping the neighborhood safe." The crowd's silent observation turned into subtle nods of agreement. The tension thickened, but Mrs. Whitaker no longer had the unwavering support she once assumed. Back inside, Tanya sat with her hands clasped tightly together. "It's exhausting," she whispered, "living under this constant scrutiny." Mr. Johnson reached for her hand. "We shouldn't have to fight just to exist here." Officer Daniels looked between them. "I understand the frustration. Unfortunately, incidents like this happen more often than they should." His eyes reflected empathy and a commitment to change. "I want to help ensure this doesn't happen again." His words resonated, but the Johnsons remained wary. "Talk is good," Tanya said, "but action is better." Outside, Officer Daniels took steps to demonstrate that action. "We'll be recommending further steps for handling false police reports," he explained to Mrs. Whitaker in a measured tone. "Making a community safer doesn't mean targeting innocent neighbors." As Mrs. Whitaker's complaints faded into weak mutterings, the atmosphere in the neighborhood began to shift. Where there had been silence before, voices now rose in defense of the Johnson family. Later that evening, a small group of neighbors gathered at the Johnsons' driveway. Carl stepped forward, extending a hand to Mr. Johnson. "I'm sorry it took us this long to speak up," Tanya managed a tired smile. Better late than never. Another neighbor added, "We're going to talk to the HOA about these ongoing issues. No one should have to deal with that kind of targeting." The Johnsons were grateful for the show of support, though the weight of their earlier experience lingered. They knew that real change would take time. In the days that followed, the neighborhood buzzed with discussions sparked by the incident. The Johnsons, though initially hesitant to draw more attention to themselves, recognized the importance of turning this moment into a catalyst for change. Conversations shifted from whispered discontent to open dialogues about race, bias, and the responsibility of community members to foster inclusion. Carl and a few other neighbors took the lead in organizing a neighborhood meeting. The goal was clear: address what had happened and ensure that such incidents would not be tolerated in the future. Despite her initial resistance, Mrs. Whitaker begrudgingly agreed to attend, her stance softening under mounting community pressure. On the evening of the meeting, the Johnsons entered the community center to find it packed with familiar faces. Tanya felt a mix of nervousness and hope as she surveyed the room. Carl stood near the front, clipboard in hand, while Officer Daniels had agreed to attend as a community liaison. "Thank you all for coming," Carl began. "We're here because something happened that shouldn't have. The Johnsons are part of this neighborhood, and they deserve to be treated with the same respect as anyone else." A murmur of agreement swept through the room. Tanya cleared her throat and stood up, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of her words. "We've been here for years," she began. "We love this community. But what happened the other day wasn't just about a misunderstanding or a simple mistake. It was about something deeper. No one should have to live in fear of being targeted because of who they are." Her words resonated deeply with many in the room. Even those who had been indifferent before began to see the importance of standing against bias and prejudice. Mrs. Whitaker, sitting stiffly near the back, spoke up. "I didn't mean for it to go that far. I was just concerned about the neighborhood." Her voice lacked its usual sharpness, replaced by a hint of defensiveness mingled with guilt. Officer Daniels stepped in, his tone measured but firm. "Intent matters, but so do actions. Misusing emergency services for personal grievances puts innocent people in harm's way and strains community trust. It's important to recognize that what may seem like harmless concerns can escalate into serious consequences for others." The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. Tanya softened her stance just slightly. "We all want to feel safe in our homes," she acknowledged. "But real safety comes when everyone is treated with dignity and respect." By the end of the meeting, a plan had taken shape. The HOA committed to reviewing its guidelines to address harassment and false reports. A neighborhood diversity council was proposed, with Tanya nominated to co-lead alongside Carl. The goal: foster an environment where every family felt safe and valued. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors lingered, engaging in conversations that had long been overdue. Mrs. Whitaker approached Tanya with hesitation. "I was wrong," she admitted quietly. "I see that now." Tanya studied her for a moment before replying, "Change is possible if we're willing to do the work." The weeks that followed saw subtle but significant changes in the neighborhood's atmosphere. Jamal played freely in the front yard without watchful glares. Conversations across fences became warmer, friendlier. And while the journey toward true inclusivity was far from over, progress was palpable. The Johnsons no longer felt alone in their fight for respect. Allies had emerged from unexpected places, and even those who once remained silent now stood with them. Officer Daniels continued to be a supportive figure, working with community leaders to ensure that local law enforcement played a positive role in fostering trust rather than fear. Mrs. Whitaker kept a lower profile, but her interactions grew less hostile. While her transformation was slow, it was evident that the community's collective shift was having an impact. One afternoon, Carl stopped by the Johnsons' house with an armful of soccer equipment for Jamal and his friends. "Figured we'd set up a neighborhood game," he said with a grin. "Time we celebrated being a real community." Jamal beamed as he ran out to join his friends. Tanya watched from the porch, a deep sense of gratitude settling over her. They still had work to do, but for the first time, it felt like they were no longer doing it alone. Months had passed since that afternoon when police lights lit up the Johnson Street. What could have been a traumatic turning point had instead become a story of transformation and resilience. The neighborhood, once marked by silent divisions, now flourished with a renewed sense of unity. The Neighborhood Diversity Council, led by Tanya and Carl, met monthly, fostering conversations about inclusivity and respect. Workshops on unconscious bias, community building, and cultural awareness became regular events. Attendance was high, a testament to the growing desire for understanding and change. Officer Daniels remained a vital partner in these efforts, speaking candidly about the role of law enforcement and the importance of accountability. His willingness to engage openly and honestly earned him respect and trust from the community. Jamal, now confident and carefree in his play, no longer hesitated to invite friends over for games in the yard. His laughter echoed freely, a symbol of the progress that had taken root. Despite the positive changes, Tanya and Mr. Johnson understood that challenges would still arise. Progress isn't a straight line, Tanya often reminded herself, but each step forward matters. One such reminder came when Mrs. Whitaker, still reserved but no longer hostile, invited Tanya over for tea. It was an unexpected gesture, met with cautious curiosity. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Mrs. Whitaker admitted as they sat on her porch. "I can't change the past, but I want to do better." Tanya nodded thoughtfully, acknowledging that is a good place to start. Their conversation wasn't filled with instant resolutions or newfound friendship, but it was a step toward healing. Both women recognized that change required effort, humility, and time. At the neighborhood's annual block party, the Johnsons stood side by side with families they had once felt isolated from. Carl flipped burgers on the grill, neighbors mingled freely, and kids played soccer in the street without a care. As evening fell, Tanya stood beside Mr. Johnson, watching Jamal score a goal amidst cheers from the crowd. "We've come a long way," she said softly. Mr. Johnson squeezed her hand. "And we'll keep going." Carl walked over, raising a toast to the crowd. "Here's to the Johnsons for being the heart of this community," he announced. "And here's to all of us for becoming better neighbors." The crowd erupted in applause, but for Tanya, the true victory lay in the quiet transformations, the subtle shifts that marked a neighborhood no longer divided by fear or prejudice. As the night deepened, Tanya reflected on the journey their family had traveled. It wasn't perfect, and there were still conversations to be had, lessons to be learned. But this much was certain. Progress had taken root, and the Johnsons were proud to be part of a community learning to thrive together. The path forward was clear, marked not by isolation, but by the hope that when people come together with open hearts and minds, real change is always possible.